This presentation is based on the book, What Makes New York City Run, written by a longtime league member, Adrian Kivelson, who clearly explained the New York City Charter in all its complexities in ways we can understand. The book is available in an e-version on Amazon. So, what are your concerns? Let's pause for a minute and think about our concerns about local issues. This upcoming election is totally local, right here in the city. What are you concerned about? Housing, policing, transportation, garbage pickup, playgrounds? It's really about how can we affect change? And it's about who has the power. And the answer is we do. We get to elect those elected officials based upon their ability to do the job. So in this presentation today, we're going to focus on the power and the limitations of power in the 5 elected city positions as outlined in the city charter and the elected borough district attorneys. We will examine their individual unique toolboxes and also reflect on our power as voters and how all this affects our lives, how significant local elections really are. We're going to come to understand the roles and responsibilities of these elected officials so that we can be informed and effective voters. Remember, in times of surplus or in times of budget cuts, it's the city officials who determine how money gets spent or saved. So let's start with the 3 citywide elected officials. These 3 officials, the mayor, the comptroller, and the public advocate, will appear on all ballots in New York City. So let's start with the mayor. The city charter gives the mayor a lot of power. These are some of the roles of the mayor. The mayor gets to appoint the heads of most agencies, including the commissioners of health, fire, police, sanitation. The mayor must approve or veto any bill that's passed by the city council. And the mayor proposes a budget every year for the city and must present that budget to the city council every spring. The mayor develops a long-term strategic plan that will help the city develop in a good way, we hope. The mayor can create a new agency to do work that's not being handled by any other agency, and the mayor can abolish an agency that's not needed anymore. So let's take a look at a specific example of something the mayor has done. When we think about long-term strategic planning, for example, in 2014, Mayor Bill de Blasio unveiled Housing New York. This is a 5-borough, 10-year plan to create and preserve over 200,000 high-quality, affordable homes over this 10-year period. So that would be an example of something that the mayor can do. Let's turn our attention to the comptroller. The power of the comptroller is audit power. There are very strong constraints in place in the city charter to avoid the pitfalls of what happened in the 1970s and 80s when New York City almost went bankrupt. The comptroller is elected, and the reason the comptroller is elected is so that the comptroller is independent of the mayor and the city council. The comptroller advises the mayor and the city council on financial conditions of the city. They recommend fiscal policies and financial transactions to benefit the city. The comptroller audits and investigates all matters related to city finance. The comptroller is basically the caretaker of the city's money and vigilantly watches for any sign of corruption. The comptroller must audit and report to the mayor and the city council every year by March 1st. The process must be transparent. Interestingly, New Yorkers have the opportunity, therefore, to use this tool that the comptroller has established called Checkbook NYC. And I just want to show you Checkbook NYC. This is literally like looking into the checkbook of New York City. And you can click on how money is being spent in real time. What are the contracts? What's the payroll? What kind of revenue? What's the budget? And as a New Yorker, you have access to this information. Another important example of what the Comptroller has been doing is to make sure that corruption does not exist and that money is being spent wisely. Here's an example of a watch list that the Comptroller has created. This particular one is looking at homeless services. And if you notice, spending has increased pretty significantly over time. But you notice the number of people being served has pretty much flatlined. So this would be an example of something that the Comptroller is going to be keeping an eye on. Let's take a look at the public advocate. The public advocate's power is subpoena power. The public advocate is also first in line to succession for the mayor if the mayor cannot complete their term or serve. The public advocate, think of the public advocate as the eyes, ears, and mouth of all New Yorkers. The public advocate literally advocates for the public by monitoring, investigating, and responding to all citizen complaints. The public advocate monitors public information and complaints from New Yorkers all over the city. They investigate and attempt to resolve the complaints and checks to see if there's a pattern of complaints. They may hold public hearings on the performance of city agencies to be sure that the promised services are being provided and that they're complying with the law. The public advocate does not have a vote in the city council, but they may introduce legislation to the city council. They must report to the city council every year. They chair the Commission on Public Information and Communication, and the public advocate appoints one member of the City Planning Commission. So let's take a look at an example of something the public advocate has done. So our present public advocate, Jamani Williams, set up something called the Landlord Watch List. And this is, again, something that we as New Yorkers have access to. And this is a map. In a second, there we are. This is a map of the city. And if you hover over any of these black dots, it will show you the building, the address, the landlord, the number of units, and the number of violations against that landlord. So again, a very good, transparent way to monitor problems and complaints in the city. So let's turn our attention now. Let's turn our attention now to borough-wide elected officials. Now, here's where everybody's ballot is going to look a little bit different, because these elected officials only serve in their own districts. So, for example, each borough has a borough president. Each borough has a certain number of city council members based on population, and each borough will have a district attorney. Very importantly, this is why we have to vote where we're represented. This is why in New York City, you can't just walk into any poll site and expect to vote. So if you work in Manhattan but live in the Bronx, you have to vote where you're represented, in the Bronx. And this is something that, as poll workers notice, we have this problem a lot where people try to vote where they work, but that's not where they're represented. We have to vote where we're represented. So let's take a look, first of all, at the city council. So the power of the city council is the power to pass laws, and they can pass laws based on two criteria. One, to change the city charter, and they can pass laws for anything that is city related, city focused. For example, The city council can pass traffic laws in the city and establish speed limits on city streets. That would be an example of a city law. The changing of the city charter was done recently with ranked choice voting, when the city council passed the election reform bills and included ranked choice voting for the primary. The city council gets to approve or disapprove the city budget proposed by the mayor. It approves or disapproves the city planning commission's land use decisions in areas of zoning, housing, urban renewal, any plans or projects. They investigate any matters related to property or governance, including participation of minority and women-owned businesses in the city's procurement processes. The city council must approve agency heads, including Board of Elections, Board of Health, and the Tax Commission. They assist their constituents to navigate social services and city agencies. Now, very importantly, city council members also have the opportunity to participate in participatory budgeting. To do this, each participating city council member commits at least $1 million of their budget for their community to select capital projects for funding. So for example, parks, libraries, schools, public housing, community spaces may all be funded using participatory budgeting. The entire community is invited to participate in these meetings and then vote on the proposal to be funded. So be sure to ask your city council member if they're participating in participatory budgeting. Another example of a law that city council has recently passed in 2019, they require that the roofs of certain buildings be covered in green or have solar panels on them. So again, that's an example of a city law. Let's turn our attention to the borough president. Now, the power of the borough president is in delivery of services rather than finance. They function like the county executives in other New York counties. The borough presidents must be consulted by the mayor and the city council on any budget expenditure for their borough. They may propose legislation and budgetary expenses for their borough to the city council and the mayor, and they get to allocate discretionary spending for their borough. They review all land use decisions that affect their borough, and they coordinate citizen complaints and chair a board of council members and community board members, more about that in a minute, in their borough. They appoint one member to the Department of Education and the City Planning Commission. Now, let's talk about community boards for a minute. There are 59 community boards across the city. They really are the first line of defense for New Yorkers to have our needs and our concerns addressed. They do not necessarily align with city council districts because, unlike other districts, these districts have not been redrawn in a really, really long time. So it will overlap city council districts. The city council members get to recommend up to 50% of community board members that are then appointed by the borough president. And the community boards are advisory only, but they carry a lot of power. Each community board represents about 250,000 residents, and they recommend projects, programs, and activities to prioritize in their district. So such things like increasing the number of bike lanes, pothole repair, and tree plantings all would come out of a community board's recommendation. You can serve on your community board just by filling out an application on your borough president's website. And you too can have a voice in a community board. So let's look at another example of something a borough president can do. Just recently, March 22nd, 2021, the Brooklyn borough president called on the New York City Department of Housing to immediately disclose how many empty affordable apartments there are in the city right now, so we could get people into those apartments as quickly as possible. So that would be something the borough president could do. Let's turn our attention now to the district attorney, the borough district attorney. Now, the borough district attorney is not in the legislative or the executive branch of government, so they are not going to be voted for in the primary using ranked choice voting. It's going to be traditional voting for the district attorneys. They are part of the judicial branch. Interestingly, their power is that they do not have to wait for the local police department to investigate a crime. Their authority actually supersedes that of the New York City Police Department's commissioner. Traditionally, the borough district attorney would be investigating issues in criminal justice reform, community partnerships, job site safety in construction and development sites, and issues of sexual violence. So we've looked at all of the elected officials, both citywide and borough-wide, but now let's turn our attention to the limitations on the power of these elected officials. One way that the power of the elected officials in New York City is limited is through term limits. And term limits are in place for all the legislative and executive positions, not the DAs. The DAs are not term limited, but all the legislative and executive positions are limited to 2 terms. Each term is 4 years, and the person may serve those 2 terms for a total of 8 years. Now, this year, there is a slight difference. This year, because of redistricting based on the 2020 census, the city council districts will be redrawn. So in this election for city council only, they will be elected to serve a 2-year term. Then we'll have redistricting, and the city council will get to run for a second 2-year term, and then a 4-year term for that same 8-year term limit. Another way the power of the elected officials in the city is limited is by the federal government. Any federal money that comes to the city comes with strings attached, mandates. Any money that comes to the city has to be spent as the mandate requires. So, for example, if the federal government allocates money to the city for, let's say, educational materials for special ed programs in schools, the city can't use that money to buy school buses or pay teacher salaries. That money must be used specifically for the purpose for which it is mandated. And the same is true in housing and any social welfare program. Another way the city's elected officials' power is limited is by the New York State Constitution. In New York State, all powers of taxation, except for real estate tax, must be approved by the state legislature. The state controls our subways, buses, trains, roads, and the airports in New York City. Remember the plastic van bag that the city council passed? Well, we had to wait for that to be enacted until the state legislature acted on it. Public schools are constantly in the crosshairs between the governor and the mayor. The city pays about 40% of the education budget for the city schools, but they're controlled by the state. Rent control is under state control also. We also have quasi-independent agencies in New York City that also limit the power of city government. So for example, NYCHA operates more than 300 housing developments with over 180,000 apartments that are occupied by more than 400,000 people. It is the largest public housing program in the country, and NYCHA administers it, not New York City. They also administer the federally funded Housing Choice Voucher Program, commonly called Section 8 housing, which assists eligible tenants with rent subsidies for living in privately owned buildings. NYCHA also operates senior and community centers in housing developments. So we've discussed power and we've discussed limitations of power on our city officials. But what about us? What's our power? So we need to talk about our voice and our power. We can interact with the city government in a number of ways. Each elected official maintains a website that we can access, and I've showed you a couple examples of those in this presentation. There is also 311 that allows us to check information and lodge complaints with the city. The Board of Elections website, vote.nyc, allows you to find out who's on your ballot, where you can vote, how to get an absentee ballot, and even what the results of the election are. Check out our website because we're going to give you lots of important information and valuable tools. One of our important sites is Who Represents Me, mygovnyc.org, which is going to give you information about your elected officials. So I hope that you have discovered that each of these elected officials has a unique place and a unique power in our city and a unique toolkit to be sure that New York City runs. We're part of that. Voting is our path to power. Information fuels that power. We elect those who seem to us to be the best to fulfill the roles and responsibilities of their jobs. Our job is to vote louder so New York City does run.